Hello, Don.
Hi, Chris. It's good to see you.
Yeah, likewise. It's good to see you as well. Good that you've come back onto the podcast.
Thank you for having me
Always-
on, Chris. It's good to be back.
yeah, always a pleasure. Always a pleasure. The reason I asked you on is because of this book, which I actually finished reading last weekend. Thoroughly enjoyed it. It's your latest book, The Last Bell, Life, Death and Boxing. I hold it up for everyone here. Um, Thoroughly enjoyed it. And it's going to be a last boxing book, which we'll get into later.
Mhm.
But I imagine most people, most more audience will know who you are, especially from last time. So, in regards to this book, first of all, why did you decide to write it? What was the inspiration? Because a lot of people have compared it to Dark Trade, but obviously there's some real differences between the two of them, not just the eras they're written. So, why did you decide to actually write this book?
Dog Trade came out in 1996. So, yeah, it's almost 30 years now. And a lot of people ask me, oh, would I ever do like a Dark Trade 2, like a sequel? And I always said, no, I wouldn't, because I just knew Dark Trade was sort of locked in the early 90s, 91 to 96. And I didn't want to just do a pale imitation of that book. And I wrote about other subjects. I did do some other boxing books, which were set more sort of in the past, sort of with the historical sort of viewpoint. But you know, Chris, I missed being close to the fighters, especially before a fight, talking to them about their hopes and their fears, being with them when the fights on fight night, and talking to them afterwards. And so I just felt I wanted to get back that kind of immediacy you can have with modern day boxing. So in about 2018, I started thinking about the idea, and yeah, it took yeah 6 years, but I'm glad I did. I actually finished it.
Okay. One of the things I noticed when reading the book is compared to Dark Trade, in fact, compared to other books I've read of yours, this seems to be the most personal book that you've written as well, and how you've written within that as well. Was there some hesitation in writing a lot about what happened to you personally? Because some of it's really deep in terms of bereavement and what happened to you, other things happened to you
Sure.
personally as well.
No, you know, dog trades are also quite personal in the sense that I give my viewpoint of what it's like to be close to fighters. But I guess back then, I was in my early 30s, and I think dog trade is sort of full of excitement about boxing. 30 years on, of course, I'm older, but also I think boxing has become more complicated. And there's a lot of things about modern boxing I feel quite uncomfortable about. And I felt if I'm going to do this book, I wanted to explain to people how I feel about it and how my views of boxing perhaps have, well, I should say not so much of boxing, but of the business of boxing have changed. And then as it happened, I lost my sister, my mother, my father, and then also my mother-in-law in the space of just over 20 months. And, I just felt I didn't want it to be self-indulgent or sentimental, but I wanted to explain what was going on in my life. So I included that, and it's only a small part of the book, but I felt it was important to be authentic to how I was feeling while I was deeply immersed in boxing.
Yeah, you really do go into some tearjerkers there in terms of you go into that as well. And one thing that you write about as well here is the impact of lockdown, not just on your personal life, but in boxing terms as well. Can you just explain to people how you would fill that space, like what you say in the book? Because I imagine for everyone in lockdown, one of the hardest things is to keep busy because we were so restricted in terms of what we could do. So if there's no boxing going ahead, like what basically just write boxing columns, do interviews, like how would you fill that space as a writer?
For me, it was slightly different because besides my boxing writing for The Guardian, I write their sports interview of the week. And I expected when lockdown started, that was going to stop because obviously we couldn't go see anyone. But Zoom, had just sort of come onto the market. And I quickly found that I could actually interview lots of people all over the world on Zoom. And people had more time on their more time to devote to the interviews. So I did a lot of I think quite involving interviews with people on all kinds of different subjects because they were willing to spend an hour or two on a Zoom interview with me because they didn't have much else to do. So I kept working as hard as ever. I was still doing a weekly interview. In terms of boxing, yes, it did come to a halt because of lockdown, because boxing, like anything else, had to go into isolation. So I did put kind of the boxing on the back burner a little bit, but I was in touch with lots of fighters and we were swapping WhatsApps and emails. So I was still involved in their lives and, slowly, working on getting this book in shape.
Yeah, you mentioned in one of your early answers about you felt boxing's become more complex in the last 30 years. In which ways? In what ways have they become more complex?
Well, I know with a more, yeah, maybe I did say more complex, but in a way, I just think it's become darker and nastier. Boxing's always been a world full of corruption. If we go back to boxing in the US in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, it was the mob were in charge of boxing. So gangsters have always been involved in boxing. It attracts people from sort of some murky corners of the world. But I felt with this book, which spans 2018 to 2024, not only did we have the involvement of people like Daniel Kinahan in boxing, so clearly there was a lot of gangsters involved in the business of boxing. There was sort of an escalation in positive dope testing, um, and then we had the Saudi takeover of boxing. Um, And also in 2019, in the space of 4 months, 5 fighters lost their lives after fights. So, Chris, it was like an accumulation of all these difficult subjects coming one after another. Boxing has always had death, it's always had gangsters, but I just felt it had become more intense than, and certainly in the sort of 35 years I've been writing about boxing.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously new players involved, like you say, with Kinahan and the Saudis and whatnot. I just wonder, has boxing always had that dark element? I know what you're saying it's got nastier, but I always get the feeling with boxing, if it wasn't for the aforementioned people you mentioned, someone else will fill that void because the whole sport as a whole is like very disorganized in many respects.
Yes, it's chaotic. It always has been. So it's been like this since even before even the bare knuckle days of boxing. There was still corruption going on. So I'm not naive. I know boxing's always been a dirty business, but just my personal perspective, I think I've looked at boxing with a much harder, clear gaze. Back when I did Dark Trade, Don King, who had been to jail for killing a man. He was involved in sort of gangsterism. He exploited fighters. I did write about that, but I think also I was kind of chuckling a little bit too, having a bit of a laugh because King would misquote Shakespeare and he was kind of a funny guy. So I just kind of played along and thought, oh, this is just part of the circus. But I wasn't able to laugh about Daniel Kinahan. There weren't any
Yeah.
sort of redeeming features I could write about. King was sort of there. You could speak to Don King. Kinahan was always in the shadows because he was in hiding. So it became murkier and darker. So that's why I genuinely think it has changed. But also, I've changed as a person. And I think I was no longer willing to just put these things under the carpet and say, oh, well, that's boxing. I felt I needed to look quite clearly at what boxing was becoming and write about it.
Well, that can lead me on to this question, which, as I said earlier, this is going to be a final boxing book. And is it the awareness of a sport that makes you think, no, I can't do this anymore?
I think, it's, as I said, it's important to make a distinction between boxing and the business of boxing. I still love boxing as a sport. I love the fighters. I love talking to them. I love being at ringside for big fights. It's like nothing else on earth, I feel. But yeah, I kind of got worn down by the business of boxing. And I started writing about boxing because I wanted to write about the skill of the fighters, the courage of the fighters, their amazing life stories. I didn't want to write about the gangsters, the doping, the sports washing. But if you're going to be honest, in this day and age, you've got to take into account those factors. So yeah, it's kind of a little bit, you could say, fatigue, but also kind of a bit sickened to the core of my being that about it. And there were a lot of incidents, like say, for example, the Conor Ben Eubank fight, which is happening now in a couple of weeks. When
Mm.
that was meant to happen in 2022, um, it didn't happen just because there was a positive dope test, which, obviously I could look at it in two ways. On the one hand, I was disappointed because I'd done a big interview with Conor Ben the week before, and, he'd shed a lot of tears with me and spoken movingly about his childhood. And I felt myself getting hooked back into the Ben Eubank fight. Um, then when my article with him came out on a Monday of fight week, and he got a lot of plaudits. People were saying, "Wow, Conor, what a beautiful interview, so sensitive, and we feel your pain. We've learned a lot about you." The next day, the news broke about the positive dope test. So yeah, I kind of swore because I thought, oh, you know, this has happened again. But then I was thinking, well, maybe it's a good thing because if someone is tested positive for dope, it's good it's been exposed. But Chris, as the day wore on, and especially as the week wore on, I began to see that the promoters were actually attempting to keep that fight, or make sure that fight would go ahead. And boxing is not like the sport like high jumping or table tennis. Boxing is about violence and it's causing damage to your opponent. And if there's any doubt about dope, you cannot go ahead with a fight. You have to get to the bottom of it. So the fact that Eddie Hearn, the Wasserman Group, Conor Ben were willing to proceed with that fight sickened me because I felt that the Ben family and the Eubank family and the Hearn family had all been scarred by boxing tragedies. So I couldn't believe that this fight was going to go on. Of course, by the Thursday, the weight of public opinion meant that they had to postpone it. But I think that was one of the watersheds for me where I thought, I don't want to write a book about this business anymore.
Obviously, about this, talk about Colin Hart, obviously passed away last week as well. And one of the things that people said about him is he just did not care. He would question anyone, regardless of reputation, as what a journalist should. And in the book, you talk about how you had a Zoom session. I think it was with Fury and his promoters. And obviously, this is when Shadow Kinahan was. And those who they knew were going to question him about Kinahan, you were basically muted during that Zoom
Yeah,
session as well.
yeah,
And I wonder, just on a wider point with that, does it frustrate you sometimes? It frustrates me that not enough journalists, boxing journalists, are questioning certain aspects of the sport. Like, for example, the Ben Eubank fight with the whole drugs issue.
yeah,
There's some journalists that are questioning it, sure, but probably not as many as you would
yeah.
think.
There's a small hardcore of journalists out there who do much more than I do because they write about boxing full time almost, and they do ask some of the difficult questions, but you can count them on one hand. And I think it is sad, and it's an indictment of journalism and of boxing that these days, um, you know, it's mainly people, and nothing against YouTube interviews. You can, as you know, I mean, like this will be shown on YouTube. You can have some insightful interviews, but it tends to be fight week of boxing. There'll be short snippets of YouTube interviews where the YouTubers are asking 4 or 5 of the same old questions. And they also know their access could be denied if they ask difficult questions. And that's why I'm not going to judge anyone because people are attempting to make a living out of boxing journalism. It must be difficult because, the promoters make it quite clear that, they don't like it and the Saudis don't like it if you ask. And Conor Ben, for example, now doesn't like it if you ask question about those tests. And what is happening more and more, I find, is that some credible journalists are having their accreditation denied. access to fighters is becoming harder to get. So it's kind of a bleak sort of picture, unfortunately.
Yeah, that definitely seems to be the case, and it's just like I said, it's a sad indictment that that does take place as well. Before we go into Saudi, just want to talk about some of the individual boxers you
Mhm.
focus on in the book.
Yeah.
And actually, one of the positives that's happened since you wrote Dark Trade, which is the rise of female boxing.
Yeah.
Now, the person you focus on is Katie Taylor,
Yes.
which, on the one hand, I completely understand her achievements, both as amateur and
Yeah.
professional, are brilliant. But on the other hand, and this is no slight on her, because I'm pretty quiet person, can be pretty quiet person myself. She's not. She doesn't seem as outspoken or as chatty as like a lot of boxers, male or female. So,
Yeah.
what was it about her that made you decide that she was going to be a focus of this book?
She's one of the perhaps six fighters I follow. And I think when I started out, Chris, I was under the illusion that I was going to kind of crack open the persona of Katie Taylor and I'd get to the heart of her because I was fascinated by her because she's been a pioneer. She's done so much. But when you meet Katie, she's lovely, she's polite, she's amiable, but she doesn't give much away. And I was kind of hoping that I could get to the heart and soul of Katie Taylor. But after a while, I kind of worked out that that wasn't going to happen. And I came to respect it because, in many ways, her fighting achievements speak for themselves. And so I just kind of, I interviewed Katie many times and she says some insightful things. But it was clear she didn't want to talk about anything personal. So I just kind of respected that. And, to be at Madison Square Gardens when she fought Amanda Serrano in one of the greatest fights I've seen live, I felt justified her inclusion in the book. Um, but yes, it's a good point that, she doesn't bear much. But with a lot of the other fighters, whether it's Tyson Fury, someone lesser known like Isaac Chamberlain, they've borne their heart and soul to me in some interviews. So I think in a way it's worked out quite well that we've got a balance between someone who's more reticent in Katie Taylor and then other fighters who share so much.
I think one of the things that demonstrates the rise of women's boxing and how we view women is when you wrote Dark Trade in the late 90s, it was barely, I don't think it was barely mentioned from my recall in that book. Unless I'm
Yeah, I think it's
mistaken.
just mentioned in passing. There was a fighter called Christy Martin
Yeah.
who fought a woman from Ireland called Deirdre Gogarty, and they fought on the Mike Tyson Frank Bruno undercard. So I mentioned them in passing, but yes, it was just an afterthought. Whereas now we can have women, all women cards at the Albert Hall. Not too long ago, women can headline Madison Square Garden, so it's been a huge change.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that epitomises that change is again when we went dark trade. Jane Couch was, I think, a year or two away from taking the British Boxing Board of Control to get a license.
Yeah, in
On that,
19, yeah, so sorry, just to chip in for people who don't know this, 1998 is not that long ago, 27 years ago, women were banned from boxing, in the UK and in Ireland, which is kind of shocking if you think about it. And Jane is a genuine pioneer who had to take the Boxing Board of Control to court, and she won that battle. And yeah, so much has changed, and I wanted to document that.
yeah, and I think what goes full circle is her was it last year being inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame,
Yes,
which
wonderful.
I imagine. I mean, I've never spoken to Jane, but I imagine obviously it's going to be a wonderful achievement, and after everything she's been through, and fully deserved.
Absolutely, because finally recognition. Because even after she won that court case, she thought her life was going to be changed, but she was still seen as kind of a freak of nature. That she wanted to be a fighter. She'd be asked onto television, sort of chat shows, and people were kind of mocking her as being this weirdo who wanted to fight. And she was just a fighter. And Jane, I've done many interviews with her over the years, and she feels she was damaged by that. And it's only in the last few years that there's been such recognition of what she did that I think she's come to find some kind of peace with boxing.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. And one place where you don't see a lot of female boxing is in Saudi. Now, I'm not here to tell Saudi what they can and can't show in their cards. They're paying the money, they can do what they want to do. But what is your impression of Saudi? First of all, in terms of the cards they've put on, and secondly, in terms of their influence in boxing as a whole.
It's quite mixed. I have ambivalent feelings towards Saudi's involvement. As a pure boxing fan, I have to say we've seen better fights over the last 18 months that we've seen for a long time. Clearly, Turkey Al Sheikh has the capacity to make fights happen. I think he genuinely likes boxing, loves boxing, and he can sort of set aside the promotional squabbles and the sanctioning bodies and actually just get fights made. So in some ways it's been hugely beneficial. In other ways, less beneficial. On the sporting side, I do think there's so much lacking in terms of the atmosphere when you go to fights in Saudi. They're not the same as being in sort of New York or Tokyo or London, where there's a long history of boxing and there's still genuine public interest in boxing. I think most Saudi people, it's fair to say, are new to boxing, and there's not much enthusiasm locally for boxing. That's changing a little bit. Um, but also for me, beyond being a boxing fan, I'm a human being. And when I'm in Saudi, I made a point of talking to all kinds of people in Saudi. And those included some people who had family members who had been jailed for anything between 10 and 20 years, others who had family members awaiting execution. And these were for social media posts where they'd expressed fairly mild criticism of the Saudi state. Those interviews kind of haunted me, and I couldn't just switch off those voices that I heard. So when you ask me the question, how do I feel about Saudi's involvement? I can give this first part of the answer, which is on the sporting side, which there's a lot of good. But when I take into account the full picture of oppression, I have a lot of misgivings about Saudi.
Yeah, and in the book, you actually detail that you express some of those misgivings in your, not just in the book, but in your writings, in some of the articles in The Guardian.
Yes. Yeah.
And then you went over to Saudi Arabia, and there were some issues with regards to passport control, if that is correct.
Yeah, there was only one issue. I've been 3 times, and first 2 times, absolutely no problems. The third time, which was in just December, so not too long ago, just 4 months ago, when it was Tyson Fury against Usyk for the second time, um, I got my accreditation late the day before. Um, oh, not my accreditation, sorry, my visa to go to Saudi the day before. And anyway, I flew into Saudi and I got there and went to passport control. And initially it seemed fine. The woman behind the desk stamped my passport, but then she paused and she looked at her computer. And something, I don't know what happened, the next few minutes, something she'd spotted on the computer. She kept looking at my passport, kept looking at the computer. And then she gestured to me to follow her. And I didn't know what was going to happen. I did think, well, maybe they're just going to put me on the next plane back to London because I knew they hadn't been particularly happy with some of the things I'd written critically of Saudi. But anyway, I was taken to an office and I just had to wait 30, 40 minutes. I was in the office for a short time where people were talking about me in Arabic on the phone, holding my passport. I didn't know what was going to happen. Finally, I was taken back to passport control. The woman was told to stamp my passport again. I said to the man, "Is there any problem?" He just said, "Go." So I still don't know. I haven't got to the bottom of that. I don't know whether there was an admin glitch or there was something more sinister. I don't know.
Yeah, indeed. It's do you think part of the reason why Saudi have that influence isn't just financial, it's also because of the weakness of boxing before it? So for example, a lot of the big fights weren't getting made, and then someone came along and said, actually, I can make these fights with the money that the fighters want to be paid. So is there as much as a problem with the sport itself why Saudi was able to come in there and do what they do?
Yes, exactly. Because there's no sort of regulation of the sport. There's not one international body. I think FIFA in football is a deeply flawed organization, which is also corrupt. But at least you have a governing body. Boxing doesn't have one governing body; it has sanctioning bodies. So there was a vacuum that the Saudis could fill. And also, basically, let's face it, with boxing, it's all about money.
Mhm.
And the Saudis have more money than almost any other country in the world. And a lot of people in boxing, I think, just saw, well, they will get paid a lot of money by Saudi and, you know, accepted that. But yeah, clearly, I think it's the mess boxing is in meant that, Saudi could just walk in. But let's face it, football, the biggest sport in the world, Saudi is going to be hosting the 2034 World Cup. So boxing's, not the only sport that has accepted the Saudi cash.
Yeah, indeed. And obviously they want to host the Olympics as well. I think that's one of
Yeah,
the dreams as well.
of course.
And we found out as well, because we talk a lot of the pro game, well, like it looks like boxing will be in the LA Games in
Yes,
2028.
yes.
Um, what are your thoughts on that, first of all? And also, what are your thoughts on world boxing? Have you managed to speak to anyone in that organization?
Yes. I spoke to Boris van der Forst, who's the key founder member of World Boxing and the president of World Boxing. And then last week on the Guardian website and in the Observer newspaper, I did a big interview with him. And it was lovely to write a good news story about boxing because, there's been a lot of negativity towards boxing, certainly in my writing. Um, and I just felt it was fundamental for the future of boxing that it stayed an Olympic sport. And if world boxing hadn't formed, clearly, I think boxing would have been excluded not only from the 2028 Olympics, which it had been excluded, but it wouldn't have been welcomed back. And I don't think boxing would have featured in subsequent Olympics. So it was an important moment. And before world boxing, we had the IBA, which was a Russian dominated organization, which was shown to be corrupt. And the IOC, I think, justifiably washed its hands of both the IBA and of boxing itself. And it needed world boxing to be formed in such a quick time, in less than 2 years, to save the future of Olympic boxing, which I think for the whole future of the sport was such good news.
Yeah, it will be interesting because I'm trying to think how many countries are signed up to it now. It's
It's now 88.
okay.
So it's not bad. They've got the bulk of the nation supporting them.
Yeah, I know obviously the Russia isn't part of that. I think
Yeah.
Ukraine is. I don't think Cuba signed up yet, unless I have that mistaken. Is that correct?
Sorry, who was the last name?
Cuba?
Cuba, I'm not sure. That's a good point. I don't know the answer to that. Certainly, Russia's not part of it. But yeah, it would be important that Cuba does become part of it because Cuba's the great, certainly amateur boxing nation of the world.
Yeah, and you don't want a situation where they're not in it and then someone wins gold and there's an asterisk next to their name because Cuba isn't there.
Exactly. You need Cuba there. My feeling is that Cuba will be there in 2028. And as I said, talking to Boris van der Vorst, he's an impressive man. And I think he's got the good of boxing to heart. And I think he'll sort it out.
Did he speak about how to stop the corruption or at least minimize it in amateur boxing? Because that was one of the major problems with it.
Yeah, because clearly in the 2016 Olympics, we had a fighter like Michael Conlon who clearly had won a fight, and it was subsequently proved by a detailed investigation that judges were choosing the other guy to win. He was a Russian. Um, I think the only way you can change it is to have fair elections each few years and to make people accountable. And under the old regime, IBA, there was no chance of fair and free elections, so they could continue, doing fairly corrupt things. And I think world boxing clearly are going to have regular elections where the leaders can be challenged and beaten. And if you've got that, you've got a chance of keeping it fair.
Oh. You mentioned actually again in the book one of a boxer is, and actually shout out to Amanda Kelly for the cover because she's done a
Yes,
brilliant
she
job.
did wonderful work. And, Amanda, I must say, because, Dark Trade, the first edition was just Evander Holyfield's face, which had been painted, and the US edition, which Amanda painted, was of James Toney. This book, we don't have, it was about a number of themes, and I must credit Amanda for actually thinking of that image, and I think it sort of is perfect for this book.
Yeah, you were there that night actually, because for those who don't know, or didn't quite see the image and had up the book at the beginning of the interview, the images of Tyson Fury on the floor after Deontay Wilder's knocked him down, and that image where he actually rises up somehow
Yeah.
from that. You were there that night. I remember watching on TV and I couldn't believe that not only did you get up, but you actually end up winning the rest of the round. What was it like to see that moment up close? And how close were you to the ring?
Well, no, actually, I wasn't there, Chris.
Oh, right, okay.
The first chapter, it's about me getting up at 4:45 in the morning to watch it on television, because I'd sort of pulled back from boxing, and but I was back in sort of the hooks of boxing, and I've known Tyson Fury for a long, long time. My first interview with him was in 2011 when he spoke to me in detail about his mental health and how sometimes he felt close to ending his life, the opposite of Katie Taylor, who wouldn't give away anything. So I got up in the early hours of that morning to watch it on television, and I felt he boxed masterfully. He was winning the fight so clearly. He was knocked down in about the eighth, I think, but was still totally dominant. And then when he got knocked down in the 12th, as you said, it looked like he's not going to get up at all, never mind to beat the cow, but it wouldn't get up for many, many minutes. So I found myself back home actually on my feet as he got up to his feet. It was incredible, unbelievable. And I think that moment for me was when I decided I have to do this book because it showed me again how boxing is like nothing else. So many dramatic scenes like that.
Yeah, and obviously that was a world title fight, but then you get from one extremes of the world title fights to British level, and again one of the fighters you revealed was Isaac Chamberlain.
Yes.
Um, what was it about him? Again, because even though I'd followed his career and he does seem somewhat smart, he's not someone who I would think, okay, I'm going to write part of a book about.
Yeah, I think I decided early on that with Dark Trade, it looked at just kind of the elite fighters, those guys who were almost, well, they were icons, um, Mike Tyson, Oscar De La Hoya, Roy Jones Jr., Nassim Hamed, Chris Eubank Sr., James Toney, all great fighters. Um, I wanted to look at a sort of a wider example of boxers. And Isaac is a particularly good fighter. He's a British champion. He fought for the European title against Chris Smith and gave him a good fight. Isaac, I believe, is capable of becoming a world champion. But it was important to me to show people who are not in the limelight. And Isaac is a fascinating person. And for me, it allowed me, I think, to show the reader the good that boxing does. Chris, we've spoken a lot about the bad there is in the business of boxing, but boxing is such an uplifting sport. Now, Isaac, I think I was fascinated because I learned early on that at the age of 11, Isaac in South London had been co-opted into a gang, and his job was to deliver crack and cocaine um, to users. This little boy of 11 So his future was not looking good. It looked like he was going on a bad path that was going to end up in him dying or being end up in jail or killing people. But his mother, who'd given birth to him when she was 17, so she was still only about 28, 29 when she took Isaac to the local gym in Brixton. He was then 12 years old because she was hoping she could get him out of the gang lifestyle. And he fell in love with the boxing because he loved the discipline. He called it the madness of the gym, seeing people punching each other. But Chris, what he loved most of all was seeing the older men boosting the young boxers, saying, "Well done, that's good. You're showing so much skill there, and do this, you'll get even better." And that's what Isaac was yearning for. He wanted a purpose in life, and he wanted someone to believe in him. And boxing gave him that. So that's why I was compelled to write about Isaac, because it also shows the goodness of boxing.
Would it be fair to say, and just to use something, and you just said your last answer, that not just with this book, but with other boxing books that you've written, that it shows the camaraderie of boxing probably more than any other sport. There seems to be this camaraderie in the gym, regardless of whether you're black, white, male, female, because it's such a environment, sporting arena. I don't think people realize how much of a sporting arena the actual squared ring is.
Absolutely. And, I've always loved the fact that, yes, before a fight, fighters can say despicable things about each other. But once the fight is over, almost always there's huge respect between the two fighters. And in the gym, it's like that. There's this, they are comrades together and they support each other. And it's, often a happy place, even though they're learning how to punch and hurt other people. This can be such optimism and unity in a gym. And that's what I still love about boxing. And, I love the interaction between the trainer and the boxer. Sometimes it can be like a father son kind of sort of relationship. Um, and they're all helping the fighter get better, not only as a boxer but also as a human being. So there's so much good in the boxing gym.
Again, Regis Prograis you also touch on as well. And
Yeah.
obviously remember his fights. I can't remember who fought the one, but the one before fought Taylor himself, Catchall last year as well.
Yeah. Mm.
One of the things you show in the book is how smart he is, how cerebral he is in terms of his writing, and obviously he can speak Portuguese. His wife's from Brazil as well, and I think with Isaac Chamberlain, you show that as well. Um, do we still have this image of boxers as almost thugs in the sense of okay, they come from say might come from a poor background, a lot of them, not all of them, but actually a lot smarter than people give them credit for.
Of course, unfortunately, that still pertains today. A lot of people who don't know anything about boxing, if you say, "Oh, you wrote about boxing," they'll say, "What boxing? They're all so stupid." And then I have to explain that yes, many boxers are not educated, but education doesn't mean intelligence. It just means opportunity. And they're denied opportunities, many boxers. But the top boxers, most of them, are highly intelligent. If you're going to get at the top of your field in the world, you're going to have quite a lot of smart thinking in your mind. Um, Boxers are also so reflective and willing to engage with their emotions in a way that many people aren't. And the two fighters you mentioned both were fascinated by books, by writing. And so I wanted to convey that. And so Regis, for example, he contacted me and in 2019, and he sort of knew Dark Trade and um, some of my other books. And so we started to get to know each other via email. So we were writing to each other. So that was a different way to get to know a fighter. And, he's a two-time world champion. He's a fine boxer, but he's a deep thinking, quite an intellectual person in many ways. So, I love to find that side of fighters too.
Yeah. Going back to what I said, where you talk a lot about your personal life outside the ring in this book, it reminded me of an interview I conducted a few years ago with Love
Yeah.
Morendo. He's obviously now living in, I think, it's Sydney, Australia. And he was talking about he talks about his life, and he was talking about why he went into boxing and the racism he suffered and the fights he used to get into and issues he had with police and whatnot. And I bring this up because you talked about your parents and how they basically defied the South African regime in what
Mm.
they did because they really wanted to help
Yeah.
people. That must have been tough going for them. As much as it took a lot of courage, especially in that time, it must have been tough going for them. I imagine they would have copped a lot of abuse as a result from that.
I think also I just need to put the context of their lives is incredible because when I was a little boy, and they were obviously, in their sort of early 30s then, they just accepted apartheid. And they taught me to respect people, but at the same time, they didn't challenge apartheid in those early years. And, white South Africa under apartheid was such a privileged existence. We had a black man and a black woman who worked for us, one in the garden and the other in the house. We loved them. They were almost part of the family. But Chris, what was so shocking about it is that when we came to make them a cup of tea or coffee or gave them food, that we, shared our food, they would be given a tin plate and a tin mug because it wasn't acceptable for a black person to share our mug and plate, a knife and fork. So that's where my mother and father came from. They were not bad people, but they were so kind of brainwashed, as I was too. I think I changed when I started working in Soweto, the Black Township, in my early 20s. And my dad had moved up from being a manual work in the electricity company to becoming the chief executive. It took him many, many years, nearly 40 years of hard work. And I used to come home while I was a teacher in Soweto, back to the suburbs, a young man full of anger saying to my dad, "You don't know what's going on in this township. There's a million black people there, no white people, and there's so many people don't have electricity. You should be ashamed of yourself." Little did I know that my father had begun to work towards electrifying the whole of South Africa. And at night, after I left South Africa, he started going into Soweto at the dead of night to meet members of Nelson Mandela's banned African National Congress. Not only he would have lost his job immediately if the police had caught him, but he would have been locked up. So it took a lot of guts. And my mother was doing similar things in another township. So yes, I lost them unfortunately while writing this book, but I always think of them each day of my life because they learned to change and they learned to open their mind to other people and to think of others. And yeah, they did wonderful things. And, Mandela, when he came out of jail, he met my father. He wanted to talk to my dad about what he was doing. So to think of how far my dad came from being in a house where black people who he liked, but he employed them and wouldn't allow them to share the same utensils and mugs, to this man who Mandela was asked whether he would consider becoming the Minister of Energy. It's quite a journey he made.
Did your dad actually get that title, except Mandela?
No, because my dad wasn't a politician, and it was just a speculative thought Mandela had that, well, my dad knew more about electricity than anyone in Africa at that stage, and he sort of broached the idea of whether my dad would consider sort of being involved in the cabinet, but my dad was always going to stay sort of working fundamentally as an engineer and not as a politician. But it just showed me, I judged my dad, always loved him, always got on well with him. But there was a time when I judged him when I didn't actually know the full story and how much he was doing behind the scenes.
Were there any boxers that you would have liked to have included in the story, but you just couldn't just due to time? And if so, who are those boxers?
Um, I think Bud Crawford was the fighter I wanted to include because I think Crawford, as he showed against Spence, when he totally outclassed Spence, and Spence is a great fighter. I was always fascinated by Crawford, and I saw him as a bit of a James Toney figure, quite surly, not particularly wanting to engage with the media. so my plan when I started out was Crawford was going to be a key figure in the book, but it never happened. Lockdown intervened, and suddenly I had these other people I was talking to, people like Regis and Isaac Chamberlain, and I felt, Canelo's in the book, Tyson Fury's in the book, Katie Taylor's in the book. They're all elite level fighters. So I didn't pursue the Crawford line. And look, I think it would have been hard to have got close to him. I did with James Toney, but yeah, so Crawford was the one I think I would have loved to. And maybe Inouye. I think he's a great fighter. I would have loved to have included Inouye in the book, but it would have been so expensive to go to Japan. And of course, the language would have been a difficult thing to overcome.
That's true, although one of the people you speak about in the book who you need an interpreter for, but you're still able to convey what you want to convey was Alexander Usyk.
Yes.
He seems quite a real character, and that's something I like. I like real originals, and he's certainly someone who's
Oh,
original. Yeah,
for he became a huge favorite of mine. Just a funny guy. He once said to me, "Oh, I wish you'd known me long ago, years before this war started," because he said, I was always joking about, and I said, I know, I've seen the videos of him in the gym, skipping, dancing, singing, making jokes. And he still is a funny guy, but I think he had to take on the burden of for Ukraine, sort of being a symbol of hope for millions of Ukrainian people. And it weighed heavily on him. But what a guy, what a fighter, incredible fighter, what he's done, moving from cruiserweight to become the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world, beating Tyson Fury, a guy who's 6'9" and a good, amazing fighter, but Usyk could beat him twice, was so good. And just to talk to Usyk was such an honor and a privilege. And yeah, I love my interviews with him.
yeah. In fact, I would say that's one thing that's changed in the last 30 years of boxing is the rise of Eastern fighters, especially from what you call the old Soviet bloc.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Could you touch on the Bivol Bertabiev fight? Is that
yeah,
correct in the book as well?
yeah. Yes, and well, not so much that one. I spoke about. I interviewed Bivol before he beat Canelo. And I think in the sort of epilogue, I maybe mentioned Bivol Beterbiev fight. Um, but yeah, fascinating characters, great fighters. Lobachenko, again, I toyed with whether I was going to feature him a lot. He only features in passing. But yeah, I think over the last sort of 8 years, you could say we've had these great fighters from the old sort of Eastern Bloc.
Yeah. I know, obviously, Dark Trade was in the 90s, and this question might be a little bit difficult to answer, but if you could do an historical Dark Trade where you could do any boxer, include them in a style like this, which boxers would you choose and why?
Going back over the years,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, I guess, well, Muhammad Ali would be the obvious choice because I knew obviously Colin Harter, I knew the great Hugh McIlvanney, who was perhaps the best boxing writer of them all from the UK. They would tell me these stories about how they could fly to the States, let's say to Miami, if Ali was based there, pick up the phone Muhammad Ali at home and say, Champ, we're in town. Can we come see you? Ali would say, sure. They'd go over to Ali's and they'd spend 4 or 5 hours just chatting to Ali. To have that kind of access, wow, I would have loved that. Um, Also, I guess the Four Kings, I've interviewed Leonard and Duran. Um, but yeah, to be there at the time with Hagler and Hearns, I would have loved that time. But yeah, there's so many I could go back to, the past. There's many fighters, and I think it would have been wonderful to do that because I think boxing now is on the margins of society, isn't it? Even in the UK, where it's still compared to many countries in the world, boxing is doing well. But back in sort of the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, boxing was the sport in many countries. And yeah, I would have loved to have been writing then.
Okay. in regard, you said it before about, obviously, we've said a few times, it's going to be your last boxing book, but you're going to still write about the sport.
Yeah.
Would that just comprise of interviews or actual issues, like say if there's another drug issue, will you still be writing about that?
No, it's going to be issues. I might become a better journalist now because I think with the books, I get emotionally involved in the fighters' lives, and I can get quite romantic and sentimental about their lives. Um, so I'm going to write books about other subjects now. But for the Guardian, I'm going to continue writing about boxing, the sport, and the business. So I'm going to do it all. I'm going to do interviews, fight reports, and issues about the things that need to be changed in boxing.
In regards to writing more books, do you have any subjects in mind about what you're going to write about next?
Uh, I'm just taking a little time out, but I've written books about all kinds of subjects, about the sex business, about criminal lawyers, about South Africa, about other sports. So I'm interested in life and all aspects of life. So I'm going to, you know, delve into all kinds of different subjects. At the moment, I'm not sure what's next, but I'm looking forward to it.
If people want to find any of your work to read, where can they go besides buying your books?
I've got a website which is donaldmcrae.com, and that's got a list of, I've got all my books, and I've got a background on each of the 14 books that I've written so far. And so that would be, I think a good starting point.
Oh, cool. Dan, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I'm so happy I got you back on the podcast.
Thank you, Chris. I've so appreciated talking to you, and thanks for your excellent questions.
I'll leave the description of your website in the description box below.
Okay,
You
lovely.
know, look at that. But
Thank you.
thank you for so much for coming onto the podcast.
I enjoyed it, and hopefully we'll talk again.
Then here's the thing about this fight, right?
Two lightweight greats, both of them fighters with violent styles.
They cared less about their safety and more about inflicting punishment.
Both more similar than they would ever admit to being.
It was like Ed Wargrass was getting cloned by Valerie Nelson. I don't think they liked each other too much.
And yet they carried on one of boxing's bitterest rivalries.
They had too big of a heart for their own good.
It's going on and on and on.
40 rounds. That's 2 hours that these guys were just beating on each other.
One that would condemn them both to utter ruin.
Maybe the single most brutal fight in boxing history.